I'll try and keep this video quick. We're going to be looking at camera settings. This is the first one of a few videos that I'll do, and we will be looking specifically at exposure and how to control the settings for that. So there are many principles of photography, important ones when you're trying to learn the field, but we'll be looking specifically right now at how to operate a camera, what settings you can use when operating the camera, and what exposure is and how you can use the camera to change the exposure settings. In later videos, we'll look at composition and lighting. So first we need to look at how cameras work. So if you look at this video, diagram here, I'll explain basically. So this is basically what a camera looks like on a very crude version. Cameras are incredible pieces of technology, and and to describe how they work in a few sentences is difficult, but essentially they work by taking in light and turning that light into an image. So the light comes in through the lens. So if this here is the lens, this is a side view, this is the lens. The light comes in through the lens and enters the camera. It has to get past the shutter, which I'll explain a bit later. So the shutter is a thing that opens like a curtain. The curtain opens, the light comes in through the lens. Once the light comes in, it hits this thing here, which is the image sensor, a little computer chip at the back. So the light hits the computer chip, and then that computer chip turns that light, or reads that light, and creates an image. Once it creates an image, it saves it to the memory card. So light comes in through the curtain, comes inside, hits the memory card, and then gets saved as an image on the car. Hits the computer chip, the sensor, and gets saved as a image on the memory card. So this is what it looks like on an actual camera. You can see the yellow representing the light coming in from the side, in through the lens. So the light comes in through the lens and then comes past this ring here, which is called the aperture ring, and I'll explain that a bit later. So that is another thing that it has to get past. So it comes in through the lens, past the aperture ring, and then when you're looking through the camera, you can see the image here. That's because the light comes in, bounces off this mirror, goes up, hits another couple of mirrors and bounces back and comes out through this part here called the viewfinder. So that bit you look through, that's a viewfinder. When you're looking and you can see what's happening in the world there, that's because the light comes in and bounces off a mirror and comes into your eyes. And this thing here, that's the sensor. So when you want to take a photo, you press the button, this one here, the shutter release. You press the shutter release, and what that does is it opens up that shutter, that curtain, and lets the light come through and hit the image sensor. So when you press that shutter release, this mirror will come down, and then it no longer reflects the light up. So the light will now go straight to this part here. And then this shutter here, this curtain, will open up, and the light will hit the sensor. So if you're just holding a camera, it won't take a photo. That's how it works. It doesn't take a photo. It's soaking in light. You can see it. You can see what's happening because the light's coming in and bouncing off the mirrors. But as soon as you press that button, the mirror flips down, the curtain opens, the shutter, and the light hits the sensor. And here's just another view of it from another side. So you've got the lens, the aperture ring, which I'll explain a bit after. Here's the mirror. It sits on top like that, and then it comes up and down. And that little green bit there is the sensor. So cameras basically work by taking light in from a scene. Then that light is turned into an image when it is read by the image sensor. But how come, if all cameras go through the same process, how come professional photographers can take images that look so much more interesting and creative than ours? And that's because they know how to control exposure. So exposure is a measurement of the amount of light that enters the camera. And the amount of light that enters the camera can be controlled by three things. These are the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. So a photographer will adjust the shutter speed to increase or decrease the exposure, the amount of light that comes in, and same with the aperture, same with the ISO. So shutter speed. Shutter speed is the first point of the exposure triangle. This is a setting you can control on the camera, and changing the shutter speed setting will determine how long the shutter in the camera stays open for. So that curtain that I was talking about that opens and lets the light come through to hit the sensor, if that stays open for a long amount of time, then that's a slow shutter speed. So slow, open, close, slow. But if it's open for a short amount of time, then it's a fast shutter speed because it's open, close. So when it's open, close, that whole amount of time light is coming through. So there's more light coming in, there's a higher increased exposure, more light gets in. But if you have a fast shutter, fast curtain, then the light only comes through for that amount of time, which means that there's less light coming through. So the more light, the longer the shutter speed, the more light, the brighter the image. The quicker the shutter speed, the less light, the darker the image. Aperture is another setting that can control the exposure. It's the second point on the exposure triangle. And changing the aperture will determine how wide the opening in the lens is. So this picture that I showed you just before, this ring here, there's a little ring inside the lens, and you see the opening there where the light comes through. When you change the aperture, you're changing how wide that hole is open or how closed it is, how small the opening is. And that can be done by changing the aperture. You see these rings, these blades, they close in on each other and become a smaller opening or a larger opening. And you can see it there as well. So increasing the aperture means you have a wider opening, which is it's called a large aperture. When it's bigger, more light comes through. When you decrease the aperture, you make it smaller, it's a narrower opening, and only a small amount of light can come through. So therefore, if you're taking photo at night time, then you're going to want a slow shutter speed because you want light to come in for a long amount of time, or you're going to want a wide aperture so that more light can get through the opening. Or vice versa, if you're taking photos on a bright day, you're going to want a fast shutter speed because it's too bright. You don't want too much light to come through or it'll be overexposed. You want a small amount of light with your shutter speed, or you want to have a very narrow opening, which means you want to have a small aperture. One of those. The third one is ISO. ISO is the final point of the exposure triangle. Is a setting you can control on the camera, and changing the ISO setting will determine how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. So the little red sensor that I was telling you about, this one here, by changing the ISO, you change how sensitive or how much light that will pick up. So think of it in terms of like being a sponge. If it's like a big sponge or a sponge that's capable of soaking up a lot of water, then it soaks up a lot more water, soaks up a lot more light. But if it's like an old, dodgy, smaller sponge, then it's not going to soak up very much water. So you can change how sensitive that sponge is to water, or in this case, the sensor, changing how sensitive that sensor is to light. So you can make that sensor soak up more light or less light, depending on how sensitive it is. So if you increase the ISO, you make the sensor more sensitive, which means it picks up more light. But if you decrease the ISO, you make it less sensitive, which means it picks up less light. So again, with the nighttime thing, high ISO means you're going to get more light, means you're going to be able to take photos in much darker locations. And low ISO means less light gets through, so it's better for brighter locations. So I'll just turn this camera off for a second. This one. So now we know that we can alter the shutter speed and aperture and the ISO on our cameras. So on the camera, we can increase or decrease these settings, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and this will control the amount of light that's taken in. And depending on the brightness or the darkness of where we're taking a photo, we need to make decisions on how we're going to change those settings. So those settings change the amount of light that comes in, but again, it depends on what our desired effect is and where we are, what the setting is, will determine how we change, which setting we change and how we change it. So therefore, we should be able to understand that exposure is a measurement of light received by the camera. The camera measures light, and its exposure is what is the result. I guess you could say. So a lighter exposure is an image where there has been more light that has been taken into the camera, and a darker exposure is an image where the exposure settings have been adjusted to allow less light. And there are cases when you might want an image to look really bright and lightly exposed, or a bit darker and more ominous, maybe having a lower or darker exposure. But what else happens when you change these settings other than making an image brighter or darker? There are effects that occur on the images. So aside from making an image brighter or darker, when you change the shutter speed, there is another effect. So consider this. If I take an image for 2 seconds with a shutter speed of 2 seconds, then the shutter's open for 1, 2, close. That means for that whole amount of time, the camera is recording light coming in. So other than that being bright, because a lot of light comes through, what else is going to happen if, say, a ball gets thrown past, or a sprinter goes running in front of the camera as that shutter is open? It's going to be a blur. It's not going to be a sharp image like this. A slower shutter speed means that whatever happens is going to be blurred, which makes sense. And a faster shutter speed means it's going to be captured or frozen. So the terms for this is motion blur, when we have blurred motion within a frame, and then frozen motion is when we have something that's stopped in a frame. And those two effects are achieved by faster or slower shutter speeds. There are reasons why you might want to use slow shutter speeds, though, because you might not always want to have blurry photos of people, but in cases like this, so you see here, a slow shutter speed has been used to make the water appear milky and smoky and like mist. That's actually just water coming in and out on the rocks. But because the slow shutter speed's been used, say 10 seconds, in that 10 seconds, the water's come, gone, gone. And in that time, it creates that effect of it just burning in and creating a milky effect. And when you have a tripod and the camera sits on the tripod, the rocks don't move. So the rocks stay normal, but the water moves and it creates that effect. So that's when you can use motion blur. Frozen motion, the opposite end of the spectrum, you want a really fast shutter speed to capture effects like this, where you've got explosions of movement and animals and people sporting and whatever. So like you can picture the types of photos: balls getting hit by tennis rackets and getting squashed right at the impact. Those sorts of times are when you want frozen motion. We'll keep going. So Aperture is the second one that we talked about. That was that opening in the hole, the wideness within the lens, the opening, the ring that goes wider and narrower. So aside from making the image brighter or darker by allowing more or less light into the image, changing the aperture also controls the depth of field. The depth of field is a three-dimensional area. Think of it as a three-dimensional area within the scene of the photo, the area that you're taking a photo of. And that three-dimensional area is what will be in focus. So if you can see me, I'm standing here and I'm taking a photo this way of something that's right in front of me. So that's the three-dimensional area in front of me. That when I change the aperture, I change the depth of field. How much of that space is in focus or out of focus? So you might want to have everything. You might have 3 people standing in a row, and you might want them all in focus. Or you might have just one person with a background. So you might want to just have that person in focus and have everything behind them blurred. So the focus, the depth of field, would determine what's sharp in focus, and what's outside of that depth of field is blurry. I'll show you another diagram about that in a sec. But changing the aperture, that ring, changes how much of that three-dimensional space is blurry or sharp. And the technical term for this is a large depth of field, bigger three-dimensional space, means more is in focus or more is sharp. And a shallower depth of field means the image will be more of the image will be out of focus. So there'll be only a small amount of the image that's in focus, and the rest is kind of blurry. So by changing the aperture, that ring, the opening, you can either determine whether you want to have a bigger depth of field or a shallower depth of field. So here's a picture to depict how that looks. So the way we measure the aperture, you measure shutter speed in fractions of seconds. So 1/60th of a second, 2 seconds, 1/150th of a second, or 2 whole seconds. Whereas aperture, you measure it by a number or a value called the F number. And I don't really know what it means. It's just probably someone's name, but it's irrelevant. The point is that a lower end of the scale, so F, so when you have a low F number, F 1.4, it's a low F number, but it's a large aperture. So the aperture means hole or opening. So large opening, small F number. But when you have a small F number, see here f2.8. So f2.8, that's around here, this one. So that's still a small, a small F number. And you'll see the depth of field, that three-dimensional area of field of focus I was telling you about. So probably the easiest to look at the bottom one here. So this one here, how we've got a tiny little opening in the lens, only a small amount of light can get through, and that has the effect of having a greater portion of the image from the front here all the way to the trees at the back, if you're looking at it from side on. That whole area there is in focus. So you see how the picture would look there, hypothetically. You'd have the flowers in the front, you'd have the moose, and the trees at the back, they're all sharp. Whereas in the middle here, you're going to have a smaller depth of field, but it's still quite large. So you've got enough to get the flowers and the moose, and that's having a slightly larger opening, or a larger aperture. And then you'll see here you've got the moose is in focus, the flowers in focus, but the trees at the back are blurred. And then right up the top here you've got a much bigger opening, a larger aperture, which means that the depth of field becomes much smaller now. So the only part that's in focus now is the flower, as you can see from the side view. And then you look over here and you see, yeah, flowers in focus, but the rest is blurry because it's so much less. The depth of field is so much smaller. So the way we measure the depth of field, or the aperture, is using the F number, as I said, and it's kind of confusing because it's the opposite. So a low F number means a large aperture, and a high F number means a small aperture. But you can think of it in terms of depth of field. So a smaller number means shallower depth of field, less in focus. A larger number means more in focus. So there are reasons why you would want, everyone likes the blurry photo with, the person with their face sharp, but then the background blurred out. But there are times when you want to have a large depth of field, like landscapes, where you want to have something in the front here in focus, but then you've got trees and whatever, hills and mountains at the back that you want to have sharp as well. So using a larger depth of field means you can just have these sorts of images appearing the way you want them. A shallow depth of field, we all know the photo where you have, the person, they're in focus, but then behind them is blurred, and you can see here as well, even in the foreground here, it's starting to become blurry, and that has the effect of drawing the viewer's attention to that subject. So finally, we have ISO, and this also has an effect on the image other than making it brighter or darker. Changing the ISO value controls the image grain or noise. Increasing the ISO will alter the amount of light that is picked up by the sensor. So that little red thing that I was telling you about before, the sensor that gets light, that hits it and turns it into a photo, you can change how sensitive. I think I talked about it before with the sponge. You can make it soak up more light or less light. The good thing about it soaking up more light is it means the images will be brighter. But the bad thing is it doesn't just suck up light, it sucks up static, I guess you could say. So think about if something's more sensitive, then it's going to pick up more impurities and stuff like that. So it's kind of a bad way of explaining it, but a bad analogy. But it's essentially what it does is it increases the sensitivity of that sensor, meaning that it'll soak up more light, but it'll also be more sensitive to static and impurities. And what those static and impurity things are is called image grain or image noise. So when you see an image, and I'll show you one in a sec, that has little fuzzy, staticky looking grainy bits on it, that's called image noise. And that happens when you have a high ISO. and it does not happen when you have a low ISO. So basically, you don't ever want to use a high ISO because you're going to have a poor quality image. You only do it if you absolutely have to. And that's when you've maxed out your shutter speed or your aperture. You've got the settings that you need with those other ones set, and you can't change them. The only other option is to change your ISO, then you'll put it up. But as a rule, you should always keep your ISO down. So here's an example of what a low ISO 200 looks like of the same subject, but a different ISO. So this one's ISO 3200, which is quite high. So you can see how grainy and fuzzy and staticky this one looks, and you can just see how there's less quality. It's not as sharp. You can't just see those fine edges because it's all grainy and fuzzy. Whereas this one here, you can see nice sharp outlines. So that's the difference. So image grain, keep your ISO down. It lets less light in, but it means your image will be sharper. So therefore, what you've got to do is try and balance these other ones. So that's the final thing I want to get to, is the exposure triangle. It's called the triangle because these things are interrelated. If you change your shutter speed, make it slower, you now have to change one of these other settings up or down. So they're like, think of it like a balancing act. If this one goes up, this one has to go down. This one goes up, this one has to go down. So there's three of them. You have to balance them however is most relevant to the scene that you're taking a photo in. So if you want to create an effect like this one, you might look at it and say, all right, I want to show a slow shutter speed. So a slow shutter speed means it's going to let in more light. So you go and you take your photo with a slow shutter speed. Then you notice that you've got this effect on the water the way you want it to be, but this sky is just completely white and blown out and it doesn't look good because your shutter speed was too low. So now you need to work out, all right, well, how can I make the image darker? So how can I decrease the exposure? So I don't want an overexposed image, means too much light. I don't want it to be overexposed, but I still want to have the effect on the water. So I need a slow shutter speed, but then I need to make the image darker somehow. So I might make the aperture smaller or decrease the F number, increase the F number, meaning that will change the depth of field. So it might mean that this stuff in the back becomes in focus when I didn't want it to, or I did want it to, depending. That's the trade-off. You have to decide, do I want more depth of field, less depth of field, or do I want a slow shutter speed or faster shutter speed? And then once you've decided those two, then you determine, am I willing to increase the ISO or decrease the ISO to finalize the image? And that's how these three interact. So there's the three, as I was saying here. If you might have the motion blur, or you might want it to be sharp. You might want it to have more in focus or less in focus. And you obviously want to have less image noise, but if you have to increase it, how far are you willing to go? So that's the exposure triangle, and that's an overview of how the three elements of exposure work. I hope that you understand all that. Please feel free to watch this again. And in the next video, I'll look at some other camera settings that are relevant to this stage in the course. Okay, thank you.